Let's go ahead and begin this session. I'm Arden Hopkin. I'm glad to be here with you. This is maybe the most important session for me in the convention because I want to try to address needs and concerns that you folks may have about how you teach voice in your caller classes. And I have some ideas. Over breakfast, I sat with some folks and I asked them to tell me what I ought to talk about, and they offered some very good suggestions. So I've given some thought to those things. But I'd also like to just open it up for you folks to respond to questions, issues that concern you in the way that you run your caller schools as it relates to voice. How can I help you? Let's just take a moment and I'll pass the microphone around.
I have a close friend, caller, who is about to have, for the second time, a cyst removed from his vocal cords. And the first time he said, well, I know you've had some voice training, but I'm not interested. This time he's going to come to me for help, and I would appreciate anything you can tell me.
The first thing I'd say is that he needs to desist from what he's doing.
That's bad.
He did
the last time for 6 months.
Yeah. Other issues. There is an answer. There are a couple of potential answers having to do with that. Let's turn here.
Probably a pretty major thing that we all have to deal with is pitch control problems.
I don't know. You know how they tune guitars and violins? They just take the thing. You just get a hold of his ear and just twist it like this until turn it one way and.
Will that work?
It will work if you twist hard enough. It will raise pitch substantially.
There's another part of the anatomy you can do that too, as it raise the pitch somewhat. What can we, who are not professionals as you, how can we help our student callers to be able to sing better and not tell them something that will cause damage to their throat or their vocal folds?
That question that you raised is the one that concerns me the very most, because the greatest damage that can be done is by a person that has a little bit of information. And that's really hard. So that was one of the topics that was raised at breakfast this morning. So I've had a few minutes to sort of formulate some thoughts about that. Any others? So far we're looking at pitch control. This has to do with a sense of vocal health, doesn't it? Something that this person is doing continues to create damage on the throat.
The doctor has told him it's not his use of voice.
There could be, he says that the doctors say that the cyst that this man has isn't necessarily from bad voice usage. However, a cyst is just a blister on your vocal folds, and so blisters happen when there is friction. It may not have to do with his singing. It may have to do with some other pattern in his speech.
Could you give examples or how we could help somebody that has a real bad nasal problem?
Yeah, you can just get some corks. Stick them in each nostril.
Many times I've run into situations where callers have asked me, what do I do when I've got a cold, when my throat is not up to snuff? What do I do? How can I maintain my voice? That kind of information.
How to sing sick. How to do your work when you don't feel up to it. Okay. Now that's more than I can remember, but all of you can sort of help me keep track of those things. Anything else that we want to put out on the table? Because as soon as we're done laying things out on the table, I'm going to try to jump in and address those issues that are before us. Good. I want to start with John's comment because it's the one that strikes closest to the home for me. And that is, how do we get them to do what they've got to do without hurting themselves? Then, in Jim's case, I think we'll talk a little bit about what that can be, and let's see, what are some of the other issues? Pitch control. Yes. Okay, so the first thing that I think needs to happen is a clear understanding for all of you about the biomechanics of singing. You have to have an energy source, that's wind energy. You have to have a vibrator, that's the vocal folds. Then you need to have a resonator that captures that raw sound and tunes it, and I don't mean tune as in pitch tune particularly, but turns it into a human kind of a sound as compared to a violin or some other kind of musical instrument. There are continuing pieces coming out in scientific journals about that last part, about the resonance tuning issue that makes even some of the things that I've described to you a little bit obsolete. But nevertheless, the first two elements I think are really essential no matter who you are. If you want to become a caller, then you need to know these principles. If you want to become an opera star, you need to know these principles, and they're the same principles. You want to be a country western singer, it is the same principle. And there are some pieces of information that will be used for you to know. One of them is that in the underside of your vocal folds, there are some sensors that respond to pressure. So that when breath comes with a significant pressure associated with it, it triggers an automatic response to tighten up the vocal folds. There are some anthropologists that believe that the vocal folds really weren't meant for talking or for making noise, but they were really meant as a sphincter valve to control breath, to keep breath inside the body. Whenever you have a hard task to do, fighting, lifting, some heavy task, the vocal folds serve as a sphincter valve and compress the breath inside your lungs to give strength to the upper torso. And as a result of that, it makes it possible to lift heavy objects or to do heavy labor kinds of activities. When that sphincter valve is not fully engaged, it puts the vocal folds in a place that allows it to vibrate and to make language, which is unique to the human race, at least as far as we know at this point. And that makes us unique in the adaptability that we have. Now, I don't happen to believe the anthropologists, and so I think that that's a possibility that they talk about, but I don't think that our vocal folds were placed there. That's way, way, way too complex a system to have sort of fallen into place by accident. So I think that there's some divine design that's involved in that. And so I do know, however, that there is that tendency for the body, when it goes to work, for that valve to sphincter down. And that happens when a person gets nervous. I can't eat candy and talk at the same time. That happens when a person gets nervous, threatened, fearful. So it's really important to try to neutralize that behavior. And that behavior is one of those that can lead to the most damage. When the vocal folds get tight and there's too much pressure that comes from beneath, breath pressure that comes from beneath, then there is a collision that occurs on the vocal folds that can lead to vocal damage. This person that has cysts on his voice may be guilty of some behavior such as clearing his throat frequently, a kind of an obsessiveness to clear a throat can be one of those things that leads to vocal damage. In American English, also in German, there is a great tendency that every word that begins with a vowel should be preceded by a glottal stop. And so you listen to a person who speaks very articulately, and you'll hear little stoppages before each word that begins with a vowel. That can be done in a very gentle fashion, but it can be done in a very percussive fashion. And when that happens, there's an enormous amount of collision that occurs on the vocal folds. And you can create cysts, which are blisters, or nodes, which are calluses. on the edges of the vocal folds, and that can lead to some really difficult problems in terms of a person who wants to sing. So you want to try to minimize the amount of muscular activity and maximize the amount of acoustical activity that's going on in the human voice. I mentioned in a session yesterday that the human voice, in terms of its size, is about the same size as a piccolo. It's really the smallest instrument in the orchestra. But the human voice, unlike the piccolo, has a wide range of pitches and sonorities that's available to it. It also has the ability to change dynamics very, very much. And it is possible, if carefully tuned, that the human voice, a single human voice, can project over an orchestra of 100 instruments and be heard in a large hall. And that's really quite remarkable. That is not muscle activity. That is acoustical tuning. And so, in essence, what we've got to do in our session today is to talk about those things that will simplify the way that the sound is made and make it more gentle, but capture those sounds that are being made and enhance them so that they give the perception of power when it isn't muscular power. Am I talking around in circles, or are you with me so far? The first and foremost thing is to manage how you breathe. Does anybody here have any question about how to breathe? You are all alive. You have all succeeded in breathing sufficiently for that purpose. However, all of us, when we start to sing, have to change our natural breathing patterns and change in the way that our exhalation is sustained for a long period of time and our inhalation is very quick. And in normal breathing, we find a kind of a rhythm that's not unlike the ocean currents. You get the waves falling on the seashore, and there is a kind of a cadential formula that goes in breathing as well, so that it takes about the same amount of time to inhale as it takes to exhale. And there's a little pause between both ends of the cycle. But in truth, when we sing, we have to take our inhalation and do it quickly because the music only allows us a moment, and then we have to sustain it over a long period of time. And so that requires some training on our part, some purposeful training. And if we don't do that, you'll find a person inclined to let the natural rhythm of their normal breathing overwhelm their singing. So they'll take a breath quickly. The music only allows you a short amount of time. And then they will start to exhale, and their exhalation will last about as long as a normal exhalation would last. And after that, the muscles that control exhalation just quit working. And as a result, you get lots of air at the beginning of the phrase, and then you're squeezing out breath to the end of the phrase. Have you observed that in yourselves, or have you observed that in people with whom you're working? So there has to be, you have to observe, you have to teach a methodology that can help. Yesterday, I used this system, and I'd like to show it to you because it is one of those very gentle ways of introducing breath. So I wonder if I could get you out of your chairs a little bit, spread around the room because you're going to be waving your arms about a little bit. I'm going to show you 3 different ways to do it, and any one of them is effective, and you can choose which one seems to be the most effective for you. First of all, you want to take the normal breathing patterns and externalize them. Here's one way to do that. If you were to take your hand, right or left, it doesn't matter, and as you bring it down to the bottom of your torso, right in the groin area, you'll start by bringing your hand out and away from yourself with the palm up. This is representative of an inhalation, meaning that you breathe in from the bottom of your lungs and fill to the top of your lungs. That's what that's supposed to represent. Then so there's an inhalation. And then as you exhale, you just turn your hand over and you bring your hand close to your body and you push down. The idea being that the breath doesn't explode out in an upward gesture, but you actually bear down a little bit down into your stomach, like as if you were going to do it with your abdomen, which your hand is doing. So the cycle goes like this. In, out. In, out. Just do that for 3 or 4 times. You'll notice that you're just describing in the air an ellipse. And you'll notice that when you do this, your body relaxes enormously. It just settles into itself because it has an easy, natural rhythm associated with it. Now, you couple that with making sound, and you get a very interesting result. Each time you get to the full cycle, just hum. This teaches gentility of phonation. Ma 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 ma. Na ma 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 ma. Na ma 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 ma. Na ma 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 ma. Now I like to sing. I like to sing, I like to sing, I like to sing, I like to sing. I like to sing, I like to sing, I like to sing, I like to sing. I like to sing, I like to sing, I like to sing, I like to sing. And you'll notice a couple of things. Let me just keep you there for a moment and point out a couple of things. Doesn't it feel good? Doesn't that natural rhythm feel very comforting and relaxing to yourself? So if you've got a caller who's nervous about going up to sing, this little technique can be very useful to calm a person down. The second thing that I would like to point out to you is that when you go to make a sound at the point where your lungs are at their fullest, it takes no overt effort. The sound just falls out of yourself. The sound that I'm making right now is too gentle to be used in singing, but it's the nub or the core from which a good, healthy, comfortable sound can be produced. So did you all see that as you came to the full cycle, your body did not require any kind of overt gesture to make the sound start. It just fell out of you. When your breath is at its full cycle, it just falls out of you very gently. Interestingly, as you keep your hands in motion, you'll discover that you can keep that breath going forward, moving, the sound producing, with no effort, all the way through the whole exhalation cycle. I like to sing, 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 I like to sing. And as long as the breath is moving, you're not going to have any trouble. You'll also notice when you start this with your callers in school that they'll have a tendency to go, I like to sing, I like to sing, I like to sing, I like to sing. And their hand will stop. And their hand will stop about the same place that their breath stops flowing. So you kind of externalize and then watch the behavior. And the same command that says stop breathing says stop your hand. And you can see an example of them stopping their breathing cycle. Now, isn't that an interesting little simple way to deal with that? So that's one thing. The difference now is that the exercise that we're doing isn't the same as singing, because somebody name a tune that we're going to sing together. All right, everybody okay? Some of us are okay with that. Okay, now what's going to happen is that you'll take your breath. Let's get the cycle started, and now sing. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. Some of you saw some things about yourselves, didn't you? That tendency to get here and then have your hands stop. You get the breath to start, and then it won't continue to flow. Others of you had no trouble at all and found that even when you were on the tail end of your breath cycle, as long as the breath was moving, there was no strain in your throat. Did you all pick that up? The other thing that you should have picked up was that the ellipse is now very lopsided. It's long on this side and short on that side. But the value that I'm talking about here is that it never causes your body to lose sight of the natural rhythm of its breathing. You can hurry it, you can slow it down, but it still follows that same general cycle. That's a very, very simple way to teach breathing and the relationship to sound production without a lot of force. Okay, so that's one direction. Now we're going to do another kind of activity, and I'm at a little. I got an idea. I'll just stick the microphone in my pocket here, so that I can use my hands appropriately. Okay, I hope that'll be still audible. All right, so now what I'd like to ask you to do is to raise your hands over your head as you inhale and drop your hands as you exhale. So, in, Now this process is really sensible because as you raise your arms, you can feel your lower ribs expand, and it's easy to inhale. And it puts your breath right down low where you'd like it to be. So, in and exhale. Inhale, exhale. You see, this has a very similar sensation, doesn't it? It's a little more physically active, and it does indeed put your breathing more active than just the simple ellipse of the circle, but it's a little bit more, athletic. So we're going to sing You Are My Sunshine again, but with the same pattern in mind. Watch out for yourselves that as you start to sing, you don't do this. You are my sunshine, my own, or you are my sunshine, my only sunshine. So that the gestures start to belong to each other. Shall we try it? Inhale. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take your sunshine away. Okay, now talk to me a little bit about the relative merits of that activity versus the other elliptical activity. Does anybody... there isn't a right answer here. I just want to get your responses, because you're on the receiving end right now, and your callers are going to be on the receiving end.
One of the things that when... a lot of my training has been, the old standard classical voice training. And one of the things that we try to do is we try to keep people from bringing their shoulders up, because that forces the diaphragm up, which gets, kind of kills the bottom part of the lungs. And so when you're doing that, I'm thinking to myself, how am I going to keep these people from doing that when I raise my arm like this? Whereas this one, I can see that one works a little bit better for my...
Yes, that's right. Well, the truth of the matter is this thing of raising your arms is a very common classical technique. You raise your arms to get the chest open. When your arms go up, it expands the chest, especially at the bottom. So often what will happen with a person who's trying to teach posture in a classical setting is that they'll get the person to raise their hands. They'll say, okay, now drop your hands, but keep your chest in the same place. So that image can play itself out. Now here's the third gesture, which addresses some of your concerns. Yes. You don't have to go all the way up to there to accomplish the same thing if you'll just take your hands and go outward. You see that when your arms go outward, your breath very naturally sort of sinks into the lowest part of your lungs and avoids the shallowness. Okay, so let's try that once. You are my sunshine, the same thing. Inhale. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take your sunshine away. So now you have three different ways of going about that. I would not recommend that you use them all three all of the time. You find the one that you like the very best, and then when you get bored with that one, you go to another one. And when you get bored with that one, you go to another one. And you can imagine that when you get bored, they're bored too. So you want to just have a variety of tools in your toolbox to help them get that easy relationship between inhalation and exhalation. You don't need to get very much force in their singing because they're all mic'd. And therefore they don't need the kind of acoustical power that a person who sings on a stage without the benefit of a microphone needs to have. They just need easy, gentle production in their throat. Now go ahead and have a seat for a second. And as you are going along, there should still be some questions in your mind about this whole process. Let me give you a chance to ask them, and if not, I'll put words in your mouth.
So, to me happens one thing. I got a little bit dizzy by the exercise of breathing.
Yeah, that just indicates that you're not used to having very much oxygen, and that when you start to use a greater degree of oxygen, a person can become dizzy or lightheaded. I've never had a man do this to me. I don't know why for sure, but when I've been working on this kind of skill related to singing in a high range, I've had a number of women faint or get dizzy, so they had to put their head down between their knees. And I think it has to do with the pitch and the inner ear and so forth. Here's a comment at the back.
Just a comment on getting dizzy. It's not because you have more oxygen in your blood. It's because you hyperventilate, basically, and reduce the carbon dioxide in your blood. This is a common technique that swimmers use. So, when you breathe real rapidly, short breaths, you can really make yourself dizzy. So that's the effect, not more oxygen.
Thank you. Yes.
On Jim's question earlier, did I understand that maybe a person that might be having problems with either ulcers or GERDs would affect his voice, and so therefore that could be a problem that you need to recognize?
Yes, one of the common health problems having to do with singers is acid reflux. And acid reflux has grown in popularity as pills have been invented to fight against it, and then the pharmaceutical companies cause everybody to feel like they have acid reflux. I do have had acid reflux as long as I've been a singer, and it took me a lot of time to try to figure out how to resolve that. But one of the characteristics of acid reflux is that stomach acids are not retained in the stomach because the sphincter valve at the bottom of the epiglottis, at the bottom of the trachea, doesn't close adequately, and so it will relax and release stomach acids, usually while a person is asleep at night, but it can happen throughout the day as well. It can be manifest as heartburn, but it also can be manifest with that acid creeping up through the throat and through the esophagus and getting back down into the trachea. And when it gets down into the trachea, it shows some very characteristic behaviors. Since most people get it while they're laying on their back, the back part of the vocal folds, the cartilage, the arytenoid cartilages, and the attachment points for the vocal folds, which go to the arytenoid cartilages, take on a characteristic of being red or irritated. Normally the vocal folds are very white, milky kind of color, and then when they get this irritation, they show a kind of irritation that would be reddish. And so any ear, nose, throat specialist could look and see evidence of that. They would also question you about upset stomach or heartburn or early morning bad breath. There are a number of other characteristics that are associated with that. And there are solutions ranging from pills that you can take to control the reflux to surgery to close the sphincter valve at the bottom of the esophagus. But there are also other characteristics like not eating the wrong kinds of food, not eating late at night. Do I even bother to say that to square dance callers? Don't eat late at night. Yeah, that's fat chance, right? Skinny chance.
We often hear that if we hear a caller just singing rather than giving the commands, what exercise do you recommend to get them in a better mood of giving commands clearly, more forcefully than just plain singing?
That's a very interesting challenge because it comes across individually. Each person has their own interior motivations for doing what they do. Some people sing to show off. And so while they're busy showing off, they're not really paying attention to anybody else but themselves. Now, I jumped to that one because that's an obvious one. But there are other issues as well. Preoccupation, nervousness, worry about a certain range of your voice that makes you have to concentrate on the way that you sing. Maybe it's not vanity. Maybe it's self-consciousness that causes a person to lose touch with the actual task, which is to lead the dance. But whatever it is, it needs to be overcome. And you overcome self-consciousness by developing the skills that allow your voice to function more predictably. And as soon as your voice acts more predictably, you're less worried about whether or not it will work. If you're vain, that's a harder one to do because usually the voice is already working pretty well. And so sort of cutting somebody off at the knees every now and again I'm actually kidding when I say that. I don't have a good, easy answer to that problem. But there is that tendency. But to keep foremost in a person's mind what it is that they want to do, what they're really there to do, will usually solve it in a rather holistic way rather than in a small technical way. If a person really cares about communicating, that person will do whatever is necessary to make sure that he or she is understood. If command is important, the caller will make it important. And if there's lazy or poor articulation, one of the problems is that the person is not paying attention to what they're really supposed to do. They don't really care about giving that command as much as they think they do. Now, having said that, we all have peculiar speech behaviors. We have regional accents, and those behaviors can get in the way of our desire to communicate. I'll tell a story on myself. I married a Southern girl, and her family comes from the back countries of South Carolina. And in South Carolina, nobody talks with any consonants. And so I went to visit her kin for the first time, and they were telling some jokes around the table, and I just couldn't understand what they were saying. There were just no consonants to help me understand where the one word ended and the other word began. And so Uncle Bill just told this funny joke, and everybody laughed, and I was sitting there not knowing what the devil he'd talked about. I had to turn over to my wife and say, what was that all about? And she translated it. She had no trouble decoding it. But, this square Western guy, I just couldn't follow that language to save my life. Now, if Uncle Bill had been calling a dance, and he had been calling a dance to people like me, it had been all over for everybody. But he could talk. He just talked in his own peculiar kind of way. So that element can be true as well. That sometimes you just have to call to the attention that somebody isn't really enunciating. And at first they'll say, well, yes, I am. I can understand myself perfectly well. And my wife understands me most of the time. Actually, my wife never understands me. But it's not because of my diction,
On that same issue, I have sometimes noticed that callers who are reciting words that they've memorized deliver them very differently from those who are conscious of the action that they're trying to produce on the floor. That can make a difference in the emphasis that they can give to the commands.
I appreciate your bringing that up because that is very true. Memorized dialogue never comes out sounding just like natural speech, or rarely does. And we pay actors very, very high prices to be able to make something sound like they really mean it when they've just memorized somebody else's words, to motivate them properly. And so, yes, the reminder that this isn't just a rote recitation, but that they're actually in the moment. All of us imitate. That's how we learn anything, really. We just copy. So somebody buys a record from a caller that they admire, they listen to the record, and they imitate it. And they imitate many of the things about it, including the inflection of the voice. And before long, it loses its character. And you take that inflection and you move it one generation down. A caller who's a caller teacher and teaches it to, by the time it's gone 2 generations away from its original source, it's just jabber. It has no meaning anymore because it's lost its connection to the task of the choreography on the floor.
As an extension to John's question, as teaching callers, given that the confidence exists in the student caller, he's not reading, he's not reciting, he's actually following the action, and the confidence of his craft is there. Can we, as coaches, go and have them speak differently to make it more of a command, to bring out more of the command component of his voice rather than the singing component of his or her voice?
The answer to that question is a definite yes. It is possible to do that, and we do that all the time in our natural everyday speech without giving it a second thought. Sometimes our speech patterns take on a very lyrical, friendly, almost flirtatious quality. And other times they become very clear and very direct. Now, did you hear how I changed that? Do you know how I did it? Yeah. Okay, so the answer is twofold. But it goes back to the very basic skill that we were talking about, the ease of production. And when you get that ease of production and then you want to intensify it, it isn't that you change your voice. You just take that which you are doing and you intensify it. I need a volunteer to just do a demonstration. Anybody? Okay, you're in for it. Okay, Jeanette, I just want you to take your hands, and we're going to push against each other a little bit here, but I want you to put your hands back to your shoulders, and then it's in my pocket, and then push toward mine. Good. And then back again. You see, the activity that we're engaged in is just the same. She's doing some pushing, and I'm doing some resisting. All the way over to my shoulders now. Right here is normally where most singers stop in their breath energy, but it needs to carry all the way to there. And so that last few seconds gets lost. Okay, now, Jeanette, I'd like to have you do that thing that you're doing just a little bit more intensely. Push with greater vigor. Good job. Very good. Now do it more. That's very good. Now do it more. And you can't feel it, but her arms are quivering because she's working harder than she needs to. Thank you very much, Jeanette. So one would say, what happened to allow Jeanette to work harder? It was exactly the same set of muscles that were at work, but they worked with greater vigor. And my resistance was more vigorous. And there came a point in time where Jeanette's efforts and my efforts collided and led to no movement. She was working hard, I was working hard, but there was nothing happening. Her hands were locked. And that happens with all of us. There are boundaries in which we can change the degrees of intensity, and then there are points beyond which when we just can't go any louder because it just gets locked down. So right now, I'm speaking to you in a very gentle, sort of lyrical way. But as I start to intensify my voice, you hear the change in the quality. That has to do with a subtle combination of greater breath energy. So I'm working a little more vigorously here. I'm resisting a little bit more vigorously with my vocal folds, but still trying to keep that in a sense of equilibrium so that they're not antagonistic completely. And then the resonances of my voice open up and expand to make room for the greater amount of sound that's coming through. So in essence, I'm now doing the same thing in a very quiet, gentle fashion. Now I'm intensifying. Now I'm intensifying yet again. Now I'm intensifying yet again, and I'm getting louder and more full of command. But it's the same behavior. So that issue, I think, is a very important one for you to teach to your callers. So if, for example, screaming at a basketball game represents 100% of vocal energy, so you scream, it hurts your throat, that's not healthy. Nobody ever wants to go to that level of intensity. But most people can do that same activity at about 60 or 70 or 75 or 80% intensity and get a great deal of power in their voice and still not go beyond the boundaries where their muscles sort of lock up and cease to be functional. They can still coordinate, and the air can continue to flow without becoming stiff and locked. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if whispering represents 10% of vocal energy, this is whispering, that's 10%. So what is that? What is this intensification? Well, I don't know. I would guess it to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 or 30% vocal energy. And if I go from 30% to 40% to 50% to 60% to 70% to 80% to... Well, I didn't calibrate that right. I've got more than 100%. I just didn't calibrate it right. But everybody has their own boundaries. And it really doesn't matter if the person with whom you're working can only go from 60% to 40%. You still invite that person to make the difference between the 40%, which will be the more gentle, lyrical kind of singing, and the 60% that leads to greater command, or 70%, or when the square starts to break down, it moves up to about 95% to get their attention.
I noticed that although the breath intensity was there, the focus also changed.
The focus became more intense, didn't it? It moved more pointed. That's exactly right. And that happens as any kind of energy increases. You'll remember from other sessions that we've had together that when I've tried to help you find that threshold of efficiency in your voice, I have started you with a gentle sound. So that to ensure that the vocal folds are in their more passive position. I still advocate that for you as you work with your callers. To keep that, you had a hand, and I'm going to come back to you. You have a gentility there. And as I increase the stream of my breath, the velocity of my breath, it moves from breathy and diffused to clear, and from clear to rich and harmonious. Listen. And right there is my point of threshold. All of a sudden, it went from that diffused, breathy quality to a very clear quality, even with a point, even with a focus associated with it. But that was all just the simple relationship between my throat here and the breath delivery here. Didn't have anything to do with the expanding or shaping of my resonance chambers. I didn't shape a particular vowel on purpose. It just was from here to here. So most of what you have to do will be there. And if you folks were successful at teaching your callers the healthy relationship between breath delivery and relative passivity in the vocal folds, and then hitting that point of efficiency, that threshold, you would find that you'd have very, very few other problems that had to be talked about. One of the reasons that people are not articulate, that they're hard to understand, is because their jaw and their tongue is tight. And their jaw and tongue are tight because on an intuitive level there's some sensation of inadequacy or rigidity or instability in the laryngeal area where the sound is being made. So as to create a sense of stability, the jaw will tighten, the tongue will tighten. As soon as the jaw and tongue tighten, they're not free to move about to freely articulate. And so you'll get speech impediment behavior, awkwardness in enunciation, mostly having to do with an imbalance in the basic phonation pattern. When the basic phonation pattern is taken care of, then the tongue and the jaw feel less compulsion to stabilize that region. They're able to be more flexible and free, and therefore speech patterns improve greatly. Let me come back over here.
Stephanie Langhoff, the issue of pitch was raised earlier, and I wanted to ask you, one of my limitations is my limited range, and if you had any ideas for exercises that you could do to increase your range of pitch, and one of my issues is, as I go higher and higher, I don't smoothly go into falsetto. I kind of make this transition from, voice to falsetto. It's not smooth. Could you comment on that?
I can. Will you be a volunteer? Will you be a guinea pig? All right. For some people, that transition from the heavy voice to the light voice is as wide as the Grand Canyon. And you just can't sing in that range. It's very awkward. For women, women have the very same problem. It's in a different part of the range. For men, it's at the top part of their range where that instability occurs, and for women, it's at the bottom part of the range. But if you were to chart the notes on a staff on a musical staff, you would discover that the place where women have instability in their singing is the same pitch range as for men. It's just that men are at the top of their range, women are at the bottom of their range. But both genders face a kind of a chasm of awkwardness moving from the heavy voice to the light voice. So strategies to be able to smooth that over would be really in order, don't you think, Stephanie? Okay. I'd like to have you stand up. Since Stephanie has declined, you all get to be. Okay, so now the question that was raised is, how do you change pitch? I will describe the biomechanics of pitch change and then show you a means whereby you can coax people into it. There are two methods, one God-given, the other one man-made, so I couldn't resist, about pitch change. The God-given way, the way that our bodies were sort of designed to function normally, is as follows. Inside the larynx, our vocal folds are just flaps of flesh, small flaps of flesh, I might point out, that can open and close, and when they're closed, they impede the exit of air up out of the lungs through the trachea. And as they come and block the area, the exit point, the wind passes through them and sets them into vibration, and they make sound. The interesting thing about the human instrument is that there's enough flexibility in those two pieces of flesh that they can be stretched longer or contracted. There are muscles embedded inside the vocal folds that when they flex, they shorten the vocal folds and they thicken the vocal folds. And they create sonorities that are associated with the male heavy voice or with the woman who speaks in her chest voice. They're also the same muscles that are active when a person is speaking or singing loudly. They bring intensity into the vocal method, into the vocal folds. There is another set of muscles that act upon the vocal folds that stretch them from short to long. And as there's a ligament on the inside edge of the vocal folds, and as that ligament is stretched, the substance of the vocal folds thins out and they become thin, and as they get thin, pitch rises. So I'm using my hands as a demonstrator. My apologies to all of those who are going to be listening on the tape. I have one hand here placed close to my body and another hand placed parallel to it, moving away from my body. So this is the behavior of the vocal folds. When the pitch goes up, the vocal folds elongate. We think of high pitches going this way, but the vocal folds don't know high and low. They know long and short. And it's a big deal because as the pitch goes up, the vocal folds, well, let me put it the other way. As the vocal folds stretch, pitch goes up. There's a cause and effect behavior associated with that. Now, the way that many people do that is contrary to that behavior. It is that this back point where the vocal folds attach and the front points where the vocal folds attach no longer move in a shortening and elongating fashion, but they stay rather rigid. The whole laryngeal structure becomes kind of stiff and rigid. And then the breath pressure from beneath becomes quite intense, and as that happens, the vocal folds indeed do vibrate, but they begin to bow upwards under the onslaught of the subglottic pressure. And as the vocal folds bow upwards, they will they will thin. But they don't thin of their own accord. They thin based upon the pressure that's being applied to them from beneath. So that bowing can actually be fairly exaggerated at times. The problem with that delivery is that it is potentially damaging to the throat. It causes a greater amount of collision in the throat. It has a tendency to make all high notes very loud. So the person who gets louder, the higher they go in their scale, is probably using that method to change pitch. And they have to be coaxed into a different kind of environment for that, which is to establish passivity in the vocal folds. The way to extend range is to remove the tension out of the vocal folds. The more flexible they are, the more they will be able to make excursions down low and high. So the methodology that I've been advocating here recently is to create what I call a positive pressure environment in the throat. You can do that by occluding your lips, forming your lips as if you were going to blow through or suck on a straw. Last year I actually brought a whole bunch of straws for everybody to deal with, to have a tangible something to work with. If you were to say the sound that begins the French word for yes, oui, you make your lips really tight so that it isn't just a W, but it's a fricative vibrating kind of a sound. Can you do that? You know that you're on positive pressure because as you start to get the breath, your cheeks start to want to balloon outwards. So when they're in that kind of an environment, the vocal folds are free to just be passive in their vibration. Let me take a step back to explain that when you don't do that, when you're in a normal environment, negative or positive or neutral pressure environment, the vocal folds often play two roles. And this behavior will lead to that kind of destructive behavior that may lead to nodes or polyps. And that is, they're supposed to vibrate, to make sound. but they are also, on a subconscious level, responsible for controlling the exit of the air. So as a person comes to the end of their breath cycle, those vocal folds will pinch down tighter to preserve whatever air is left. Or when you have a lot of power, the vocal folds will stiffen against that power come beneath to keep the air from exiting. Well, you can see that that isn't a very useful way to do that because it increases the level of tension in the throat. So that the vocal folds should not be the gatekeepers for breath control. And they often are. So this little thing that I'm advocating for you will assist you in teaching your vocal folds greater passivity. So this is a warm-up that you can do for yourselves before you call. It's also a warm-up that you can teach to in your caller schools. Or some variation of it. There's nothing uniquely special about this. It's just one I've evolved over the course of time. Forming your mouth into that small, pursed-lipped behavior, pretend that you are starting a car. That creates the energy in your breath. It creates the obstruction in your lips. It teaches your vocal folds that they don't have to be stiff to resist that onslaught of air. They can be passive in their vibration. So you set that up. Now modulate that pitch upwards into the middle of your voice. And many of you will find that your body posture wants to change. That instead of staying grounded in your breathing, as you go into the higher regions of your voice, the breath wants to climb and the throat wants to climb. Just don't let it happen. Just keep stable. Same breath energy. Don't let it constrict and tighten. Just stay there and find a way to get to that higher note. Now, when you do that, you're teaching the muscles that are responsible for elongating the vocal folds to actually do their job. Raise your hand if you find this task to be challenging or difficult. Those of you that find this difficult, it's simply because you have relied on one particular way of raising pitch for many years, and you're habituated to it, and the other methodology, the other means, has to be sort of slipped into. You have to kind of put up conditions where it can't change, and here's how you ensure it. Whatever energy you put in the low note, you don't change that energy as you go to the higher note. And almost instantaneously, as soon as you give yourself that command, you say, I will not increase the pressure of my breath to get my pitch to go up. Your body is left with a very strange conundrum. Either it doesn't get the pitch at all, or it finds a new way to do it. And your body is an amazingly adaptable, compensatory kind of an instrument. You take away one option, it will eventually find another option. And you don't have to teach it. You just set up the conditions and let the body discover it. So we're now in the low range. Jump to the middle range. Now jump to the high range. Anybody not successful at doing that? So, Stephanie, it's coming back to you. You found yourself in a peculiar place up there, didn't you? It doesn't really feel wrong, but it certainly doesn't feel normal, and therefore your callers will often say, that can't be right. But there's a difference between right as in not hurting and right as in familiar. And so many times people say, oh, I don't like that, or that doesn't feel right. When what they're really saying is, that doesn't feel normal, that doesn't feel familiar. And you just hark back to them, the answer is, if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. And if you can't sing high notes, then you make the choice. You want to find a way to get to high notes and get that range to smooth out, then something's going to have to change. And if you're not willing to let it change, then you're going to be held hostage by your own unwillingness to make adjustments. Now, this doesn't sound very good. You know, this little frickety W doesn't make for very good singing sonority. It's a great thing to do when you're in a hotel room and you're worried about your neighbors hearing you warm up, because it doesn't make very much noise. Incidentally, there's another way that you can do that. If you're really wanting to warm your voice up in a hotel room, Just get a hold of a pillow and sing into the pillow. I'm working on a concert, and I've been up in my room just going singing into my pillow so that I wouldn't disturb my neighbors, and it's great. Okay, so the next step along the way is to do that which you've seen many people do before, and that is to do what's called a glide or a siren. You start at the bottom of your voice, set your breath in that fricative W place, and you glide upwards as high as you can. Only one caveat. One dictum is that you cannot change the pressure of your breath. And you'll find that your body wants to change. About halfway up the road, it'll want to change from being down and sustained to contracted and driving. Try it. And all I did was set up conditions where that ligament on the inside of my vocal folds had to stretch. And as I did, it went along with me. And I found myself in a very high range. I was startled myself. But I'm standing in front of you, and I have to do a good example, right? There's nothing like the imminent prospect of public disgrace to cause a person to really do it right. Okay, so now the next task along the way is to gradually teach your vocal folds that in that passive environment, they can go very high and they can go very low, they can go very loud, they can go very soft with no damage to themselves. And this is really, really important, because what you're trying to do is to set up an environment with your callers where they won't hurt themselves. And so one of the safety nets is to never allow the breath to jam or drive or compress, and to coax people away from constriction in their throat. Now, here's the next part of this thing. You go gliding, I'll demonstrate it, and then I'll ask you to do it. So you start in that glide like I just did a moment ago, and then as I get to the top, I'm just going to open up into a vowel. I move out of that positive pressure environment into a normal pressure, neutral pressure, and try to coax my vocal folds to stay in the same vibration pattern that they've been established in to begin with. So it's an invitation, it's a kind of a coaxing, it's a repetition that gradually teaches the vocal folds that they don't have to be stiff, they don't have to protect themselves. And then I do it again lower. So you just stretch. You notice that I started at the bottom, went all the way to the top, and then incrementally just popped down through the range. Now, the top range doesn't surprise me anymore. I've been doing it long enough so that I'm sort of surprised when it doesn't behave. But still, for me, this thing that I'm showing you was not the way that I was taught to sing. I was taught to be a power singer. I was taught to have that stiffness. I was one of these vocal fold bower kind of guys. And so I'm still surprised when I get into the middle of my range. You heard it happen. I opened my mouth in the middle and it went, where am I? It's a little bit like Star Wars coming out of light speed when they're at the place of Alderaan, and then there's this minefield. That's kind of what it's like when you go into the middle. So, again, over and over and over, you do that until your body is no longer surprised by what comes out of your mouth. You want to try it? It really doesn't matter whether you go to the stratospheric top or to whatever you consider to be your top. That's all right. You want to just continue to stretch your boundaries. Let's try it. So, don't increase pressure as you go up. Go. Now, any point in time, just open up your mouth. Good. Now, don't go all the way to the top. Come down about a quarter of the way and open up. Bottom. Now, middle. Some of you are automatically opting to go into falsetto. Try not to. Try to keep your real voice engaged, because that's what the voice is. That's the voice you're going to use when you're in a call. So you'll discover that you can go as high in a real voice as you can go in a falsetto voice. It's just that for most men, they've never made that attempt or figured out how to make that happen. And this is a method by which you can gradually explore that without hurting yourself. Okay? Not just to the middle. Lower third. Now start in the upper part and glide downward all the way to the bottom and open it up. Remember, as you go up the scale, you do not increase pressure. As you come down the scale, you do not decrease pressure. You don't let it fall down. You sustain it all the way down. So here you go, up in the middle. Then, don't go all the way to the bottom, go a little higher. Okay, so that's an exercise that can be used to help people gain confidence in the fact that their body is capable of wide range extension. Stephanie, does that help? Good. Hold on.
I used to be able to sing fairly low, and I couldn't get up that high. Then I learned to get up higher and do everything. But then if I have a high note and I have to go to a low note, I find that I have trouble getting and hitting that note exactly. I can't find it right away.
Go ahead and have a seat. There are behaviors that can be challenging. I did this in class the other day, and I want another sucker. Volunteer. Oh, come on. Yeah. Would you come back here to the door jam? This is going to be a physical demonstration of what I'm talking about. I'm just going to remind me your name. Daryl is going to stand here in the doorway, and he's going to put the outs. This is a game that I used to play when I was a teenager, and you probably have done it too. I'd get bored with things. I want you to put the back of your hand against that door jam and the back of your hand against that door jam. And for about the next 30 seconds or so, I want you to push outward against the door jam as if you were trying to move it. Okay? So what's going to happen is that he's going to be flexing those shoulder muscles very vigorously for the next 30 seconds. And as he does so, those muscles are going to get used to being flexed. And as he stands away from the door in just about 15 more seconds, as you stand away from the door, he'll lay his arms at his sides, and his arms, against his volition, will just rise. I used to get tickled by that all the time. I'd get bored at church, and I'd do all kinds of little games to keep myself from getting bored. And this wasn't one of them, but it was similar to that. It was on that same era when I was making discoveries about the world. Okay, Daryl, come on. Now just let your arms stand at your side. Oh, that's not working. Oh, shoot. Do you feel a tendency for your arms to move outward? Yeah. Yeah, you really have to work it hard. But you all can see the image. I was just going to set that up, and that failed flat on his face. Go ahead and have a seat. Go ahead and have. No, that's all right. But in essence, when a person gets stuck in the high part of their range and can't get back to the low part, the muscles that are responsible for the pitch raise are overextended. They're overactive. And as a result, they have to be coaxed into a greater relaxation. Would some of you check my time? Am I going over yet? Is it time? Is it time? All right. Well, 5. All right. I have trouble with this. I'm really, this year more than any other, and I'm just sort of like, is there an ending time? I don't know. Yeah, there is a methodology that can be used, and it is called the free tone, or in German, the Freiton. And it is just a rattle in your throat. It sounds like this. And when you use that sonority, when you use that method, it does 2 really good things. The first thing that it does is that it takes all of the suspensory musculature in your larynx and allows it to relax. So your larynx just sits at its most relaxed position. it also takes the vocal folds, all of the musculature that's associated with the vocal folds, and puts them at their most relaxed position. And so it's a perfect way to slough off increasing tensions. Those of you that may teach school during the day or be in a profession where you have to talk all day and then you have to sing all night, the fritone can be a salvation to you to help reestablish relaxation in your voice. And so at the conclusion of each tip, or at least every other tip, you ought to just get apart, do a fritone for about 15 or 20 seconds. You will discover, for you, it'll take you 15 or 20 seconds to find it. But once you've found it, just stay there and coax your voice back into a more relaxed position.
Daryl Clendenin. I'm probably the only one that gets students that cannot find the proper pitch during their singing, but if you had any hints at all, it would help.
I wish I had a really good one, and I do have some suggestions. They're just not panaceas.
Norm Cross, California. Scott, on your being sickly and singing and stuff, this fritone he's talking about, doing it helps condition your vocal folds to act normal and sing normal without the stress of the illness taking over.
That is really true. That's a true statement.
I was just looking for some, like miracle inspiration or something like that.
The actual miracles inspiration does exist, and that is that many times when we feel ill, we've got a stuffy nose, we've got a raspy throat, a sore throat, we have congestion on our chest, we feel like, I just can't do it. That's more psychological than it is real. And the answer to that is to ask the person who's under that duress to just do one of those glides. And if they can go, and touch every note that they need to touch, while they're on their call, their throat is fine. They may not feel very good, but their throat is fine because the big task is to be able to inflect pitch. And when your vocal folds are too swollen up so that you can't, you'll get this result. And it won't. And that's the time when you cancel. But anything short of that, you ought to go ahead and call.
I'm rather unusual in the fact that I really cannot do a fritone unless my throat is sick.
It so turns out that when I demonstrate, I have a low fritone, but there's no real pitch associated with it. So, it can be at any pitch level where your vocal folds truly relax. In that relaxed place, you can then move it across from a fritone into a real tone like this. And that creates the most comfortable, relaxed kind of low pitch that you want to find. So, if you're looking for low pitches, that kind of a delivery might be a useful one for you. Okay, so there was one last question that I haven't addressed yet, and it had to do pitch identification. Pitch identification, I hate to tell you this, begins when a child is between the ages of 6 months and 5 years. And if in that period of time they're introduced to pitch and allowed to sing with the television, sing with their mother, sing with their siblings, go to church school and sing hymns, they just pick that up, that ability to hear a pitch and be able to reproduce it with their throat. Like they pick up language, they just don't know not. And so those kids get on into the elementary school and they're deemed as being talented and they're gifted, and the truth is they're exposed. So there are individuals who come up through their lives never having really been exposed to that kind of skill. And they still can learn it, but they can learn it faster than a child learns it. But by that time, an adult is usually so self-conscious, so self-aware, that they're embarrassed to do it. But a determined effort so that somebody who can't match a pitch, you just simply hit the note and they'll go, They have no means of recognizing muscle activity in their throat related to pitch. This is a test that you can do. The question is, do they hear it properly? If I were to say to you, Daryl, can you tell the difference between these pitches? You'd say yes. But if the individual says no, then they may have tone deafness. And there is a very small population, I mean very small population, who are genuinely tone deaf. Mostly, students are not exposed. And as a result of that which children pick up over the course of about 5 years can be picked up over the course of 6 to 8 months to a year. But in the interim time, there is no predictability about their ability to match pitches. They just have to learn that same muscle skill that they would have learned as a child, as an adult, and you need to be very encouraging of them so as not to be destructive.
It's been my experience that a huge share of caller pitch problems have to do with not hearing the music. They're so focused on the choreography and the dance that they fail to listen to the music, and I can cure many of them by making them focus on the music.
Thank you. I've taken way too much time. I apologize for that. The questions that you had to raise were very, very useful. I hope I've been able to provide at least some ideas on how you might be able to solve them. And I wish you great success in training your coaches.